Judge publicly humiliated a royal guard during a routine court hearing. But minutes later, the guard revealed a secret that made the courtroom fall silent and left the judge in handcuffs. Here's how it unfolded. But before we continue, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. And make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow at this very same time, we're dropping another powerful Royal Guard story that you won't want to miss. The imposing stone facade of Westminster Magistrate Court stood resolute against the grey London sky, its weathered columns and worn steps bearing silent witness to centuries of justice and, occasionally, injustice. The usual morning procession of barristers in their black robes, clerks clutching files, and anxious defendants filtered through the heavy oak doors, their faces set in the grim expressions of those entering a place where fates hung in the balance. The arrival of Sergeant Callum Redmayne created an immediate stir that rippled through the courthouse. His scarlet tunic and bearskin cap stood in stark contrast to the muted greys and blacks of legal attire. The ceremonial uniform of the Queen's Guard seemed almost deliberately provocative in this temple of law, each gleaming brass button and precisely aligned medal a challenge to the court's more subdued authority. As Redmayne ascended the courthouse steps with military precision, conversations halted mid-sentence. His polished boots echoed against the marble floor as he entered the building. His back ramrod straight, eyes forward, the same impeccable bearing he maintained at his post outside Buckingham Palace. The ceremonial rifle, rendered safe for court appearance, but still an imposing presence, was carried with meticulous correctness that spoke of years of disciplined service. Is that actually a Queen's Guard? A junior solicitor whispered to her colleague. In full ceremonial dress, her senior confirmed with raised eyebrows. Must be that case Henha's been talking about all week, the one he promised would be instructive for all of us. The court clerk nearly dropped her stack of files when Redmayne approached the registration desk. Sergeant Callum Redmayne, reporting as summoned, he stated, his voice carrying the crisp precision of military training. "Do you have legal representation, Sergeant?" she asked, noting he stood alone. "I'll be representing myself, thank you," Redmayne replied with calm assurance. The clerk's eyebrows rose slightly. "Are you sure that's wise? Judge Henha is rather formidable." "So I've heard," Redmayne responded with the faintest hint of a smile that vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Inside courtroom 3. Judge Rupert Henhar was already reviewing documents when an assistant leaned in to inform him of the guard's arrival. Henhar's thin lips compressed into an even thinner line of disapproval. At 63, with 3 decades on the bench, Henhar carried himself with the imperious confidence of a man accustomed to absolute authority within his domain. His reputation for harsh sentencing was matched only by his intolerance for what he termed theatrical displays in his courtroom. "A full ceremonial uniform," he muttered. "How predictably dramatic." The public gallery filled quickly as word spread of the unusual case. By the time Redmayne entered and took his position at the defense table, every seat was taken. The guard stood alone, no legal representation beside him, his ceremonial bearskin cap now tucked properly under his left arm in military fashion. "Judge." Henhar entered, his black robes billowing behind him. "All rise," called the bailiff, and the assembled crowd stood as one. Henha took his seat at the bench, his cold gaze immediately finding and fixing on the scarlet uniformed figure before him. "Court is now in session," he announced, his voice carrying the practiced authority of decades on the bench. "The Crown versus Sergeant Callum Redmayne." "Sergeant Redmayne," Judge Henha began, peering down through half-moon spectacles with poorly disguised disdain. "You stand accused of assault against a civilian while on ceremonial duty at Buckingham Palace. How do you plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor," Redmayne replied, his voice clear and steady. Henha's eyebrows rose slightly. "You understand the seriousness of these charges, I presume?" Assaulting a civilian while representing the Crown is not merely a breach of protocol, it's a criminal offense carrying significant penalties. Before Redmine could respond, the judge continued, "I see you've elected to appear without legal counsel. Given the gravity of the situation, I strongly advise you to reconsider." "I will represent myself, Your Honor," Redmine stated firmly. "Very well. It's your right to do so, though I caution you that it may not be in your best interest." Henha shuffled his papers, a theatrical movement designed to establish dominance through familiarity with procedure. "Let the record show that the defendant has declined legal representation despite the court's recommendation." From the prosecution table rose a sleekly dressed barrister, whose tailored suit and silk tie spoke of private education and expensive habits. "Edwin Cartwright for the Crown, Your Honor. I'll be presenting the case against Sergeant Redmine." "Proceed, Mr. Cartwright." Henha nodded, settling back with an expression of professional interest that couldn't quite mask his anticipation. "Duck." "The court calls Mr. Richard Holloway," Cartwright announced. A man in his 50s approached the witness stand. His bespoke suit, designer watch, and the confident set of his shoulders marked him as someone accustomed to wealth and influence. After being sworn in, he adjusted his tie and cast a practiced, sympathetic glance toward the jury box. "Mr. Holloway, could you please tell the court what happened when you visited Buckingham Palace last Tuesday?" Cartwright prompted. "Of course," Holloway began, his voice modulated to convey reasonable indignation. "I was there as a tourist, simply enjoying a visit to one of our nation's treasures. I wanted a photograph with one of the guards, nothing improper, just a standard tourist photo." He paused, his expression darkening with remembered outrage. "Here, when I approached Sergeant Redmine, maintaining a respectful distance, and was shocked when he suddenly shouted at me and physically struck my arm away. It was completely unprovoked, an aggressive and humiliating assault in front of dozens of witnesses." "Did you provoke the guard in any way?" Cartwright asked. "Absolutely not," Holloway insisted, his hand rising to his chest in a gesture of wounded innocence. "I was entirely respectful of the protocols. Everyone knows you don't touch the guards or get too close. I've visited the palace many times and understand the regulations perfectly." "And the injury to your wrist?" Cartwright prompted. Holloway extended his arm, displaying a barely visible bruise. "The guard's baton struck me with considerable force. I required medical attention and have been experiencing ongoing pain. My doctor has documented the injury." Throughout this testimony, Judge Henhor nodded sympathetically, occasionally shooting accusatory glances at Redmine, who stood at perfect attention, his expression betraying nothing. "Your Honor," Redmine finally spoke, "I would like to question the witness about several inconsistencies in his account." "You'll have your turn," Sergeant Henha replied dismissively. "The prosecution hasn't finished presenting its case. But, Your Honor, you will not instruct this court on procedure," Henha snapped, his facade of impartiality slipping momentarily. "You may be accustomed to giving orders at your post, Sergeant, but in this courtroom I alone determine the order of proceedings." The actual events at Buckingham Palace had unfolded quite differently from Holloway's practiced testimony. On that Tuesday morning, Sergeant Callum Redmine had stood at his post with the perfect stillness that was the hallmark of the Queen's Guard. The summer heat pressed down on the ceremonial uniform, the weight of the bearskin cap considerable after 4 hours on duty, but Redmane's posture remained impeccable. Years of military discipline had trained him to maintain his bearing regardless of physical discomfort. The crowd that day had been typical families with excited children, tour groups following guides with raised umbrellas, elderly couples moving at a measured pace. Most visitors observed the appropriate protocols, maintaining their distance behind the barriers. Content to photograph the guard without attempting interaction, Cretchet Holloway had been immediately noticeable among the tourists. not only for his expensive clothing but for his loud commentary to his companions. "These guards are just for show," he'd announced, his voice deliberately carrying. "They're not allowed to move or respond no matter what you do." Several tourists had cast disapproving glances his way, but Holloway seemed energized rather than deterred by their reaction. He approached the barrier, leaning over it while his friends recorded on their phones. "Watch this," he'd said with a conspiratorial wink before fully crossing the barrier, stepping into the restricted area. "Sir, step back behind the barrier immediately," called the palace security officer, moving quickly toward the situation. But Holloway had already advanced to within arm's reach of Redmine. "Come on, just one photo," Holloway said, his tone making it clear he was performing for his audience. He reached out his hand, moving directly toward Redmane's uniform, a clear violation of the most basic protocol. "Smile for the camera, soldier boy." What happened next was precisely according to Royal Guard protocol for breach situations. Redmine stamped his foot firmly and issued the regulation warning. "Step back from the guard." His voice carried the full authority of his position, startling Holloway, whose hand was now inches from Redmane's chest. That, when Holloway continued his approach rather than retreating. Redmine executed the standard defensive maneuver, a sharp outward motion with his rifle to create distance between himself and the violator, followed by bringing the weapon back to ready position. The movement was controlled and precise, designed to establish a protective perimeter without causing injury. Holloway staggered backward more from surprise than from the force of the maneuver, his face flushed with embarrassment, as tourists murmured and several began recording the incident. The security officer had now reached them and firmly escorted Holloway back behind the barrier. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Holloway had hissed at the security officer, loud enough for nearby visitors to hear. "I sit on 3 government advisory boards. This isn't over. That guard assaulted me." "Sir, you crossed a clearly marked barrier and attempted to touch a Queen's Guard after being warned to step back," the security officer replied calmly. "The guard followed standard protocol for such situations." "We'll see about that," Holloway responded, his embarrassment hardening into something more vengeful. "My brother-in-law plays golf with Judge Henhar. Let's find out if your guard's protocol holds up in court." As he'd been escorted away, Holloway had made a show of examining his wrist, rotating it and grimacing theatrically. Several minutes later, once Holloway was gone, an elderly gentleman who had witnessed the entire encounter approached the security officer. "Complete nonsense," the man said quietly, identifying himself as a retired military officer. "The guard handled that perfectly by the book. If that fellow makes trouble, I'd be happy to provide a statement." "As would I," added a middle-aged woman nearby. "I recorded the whole thing on my phone. That man clearly crossed the barrier and tried to touch the guard after being warned." Back in the courtroom, as Cartwright concluded the prosecution's case with a theatrical flourish, Judge Henha turned to Redmine with barely concealed impatience. "The defendant may now present his defensive. He has won." The slight emphasis on the final words drew suppressed chuckles from Holloway and his associates in the gallery. Sergeant Redmine moved to the center of the courtroom with the same measured precision that characterized his ceremonial duties. His ceremonial uniform, immaculate despite the morning's proceedings, seemed to catch the light as he took his position. "Your Honor, if it pleases the court, I would first like to address several factual inaccuracies in Mr. Holloway's testimony," Redmine began, his voice carrying clearly through the courtroom without being raised. The quality of his speech seemed to catch Henhau off guard. Gone was the terse military communication style the judge had apparently expected. In its place was the measured, articulate delivery of someone thoroughly comfortable in a legal setting. Mr. Holloway stated that he maintained a respectful distance and did not cross any barriers. Palace security logs, which I have subpoenaed, Redmine produced an official-looking document, clearly record that Mr. Holloway breached the physical barrier separating visitors from guards, an action captured on the palace's security cameras. A ripple of interest moved through the gallery. Judge Hinhar frowned. The prosecution presented no such security footage. Indeed, Your Honor, I find that omission particularly noteworthy, Redmine replied evenly. I have taken the liberty of securing the footage myself with proper authorization from the Palace Security Office. He produced a small flash drive. This contains the complete, unedited security footage from last Tuesday morning, showing Mr. Holloway crossing the barrier despite verbal warnings from security personnel, and then attempting to physically touch a Queen's Guard while making derogatory comments. This evidence wasn't disclosed during discovery. Cartwright protested, rising to his feet. With respect, Mr. Cartwright, I submitted a comprehensive evidence list to the prosecutor's office 3 days ago, including this footage. I have the signed receipt confirming delivery. Redmine produced another document with calm efficiency. If you failed to review the materials, that oversight lies with your office, not with my defense. Henha's face had begun to redden. We'll determine the admissibility of this evidence after reviewing its provenance. Continue with your defense, Sergeant. Thank you, Your Honor, Redmine replied with perfect military courtesy. I would now like to address the Royal Guard protocols that were in effect during the incident. According to Section 14 of the Royal Guard Procedural Manual, which governs all ceremonial guards at royal residences, he produced a copy of the manual. When a member of the public breaches physical barriers and approaches within arm's length of a guard, the approved response is a verbal warning followed by a defensive position if the approach continues. He handed the manual directly to the court clerk for official entry into evidence. The manual specifically prohibits guards from allowing physical contact from members of the public, not merely as a matter of ceremony but as a security protocol established by the Royal Protection Unit. From the gallery, a distinguished-looking gentleman in his 60s raised his hand. Your Honor, I believe I can provide relevant testimony regarding this incident. Judge. Henhouse seemed to war with himself momentarily before acknowledging the man. Identify yourself to the court. Colonel James Harrington, retired, formerly of the Royal Military Police. I was present at Buckingham Palace during the incident in question and witnessed the entire exchange between Mr. Holloway and Sergeant Redmine. The defense calls Colonel Harrington, Redmine stated formally. After being sworn in, the colonel provided a precise account that corroborated Redmayne's version of events in every detail, describing Holloway's deliberate barrier breach and the guard's textbook response. In your professional opinion, Colonel, did Sergeant Redmine act appropriately? Redmine asked. Not only appropriately, but with admirable restraint, Harrington affirmed. Mr. Holloway's behavior constituted a potential security threat that warranted a much firmer response than he received. Throughout this testimony, Holloway shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Cartwright leaned over to whisper urgently in his client's ear, their faces betraying growing concern. Judge Henhar, whose confident control had visibly eroded during Redmayne's methodical presentation, attempted to regain command of his courtroom. While this testimony is noted, it represents a single perspective on the events. If I may, Your Honor, Redmine countered smoothly. I have statements from 7 additional witnesses, all of whom corroborate Colonel Harrington's account. They include 3 international tourists with no connection to either party, a retired police inspector, and a palace security officer who intervened. The methodical dismantling of the prosecution's case continued as Redmine called witness after witness, each account further eroding Holloway's version of events. With each testimony, Judge Henha's expression darkened, his earlier judicial confidence giving way to barely concealed alarm. I would now like to address the medical evidence presented by the prosecution. Redmine continued, his command of the courtroom now complete. The initial curiosity about the guard in ceremonial uniform had transformed into rapt attention as the gallery witnessed his unexpected legal prowess. Mr. Holloway claims to have sustained an injury requiring medical attention. The prosecution has submitted a medical report from Dr. Alan Mercer documenting a contusion to Mr. Holloway's right wrist. Redmine lifted the report with 2 fingers, as if reluctant to touch it. I find several aspects of this report troubling. Judge. Henhar shifted in his seat. The medical evidence has already been accepted by this court. Sergeant. Yes, Your Honor. And I am not challenging its acceptance, merely its authenticity, Redmine replied. I've taken the liberty of contacting St. Thomas's Hospital, where Dr. Mercer allegedly practices. They have no record of a physician by that name ever having been employed there. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Holloway's face had gone pale, while Cartwright began frantically shuffling through his papers. Furthermore, Redmine continued relentlessly. The registration number on the medical letterhead corresponds to a physician whose license was revoked 3 years ago for falsifying medical documents in insurance cases. A rather unfortunate coincidence, wouldn't you agree? Redmine now turned to face Holloway directly. Mr. Holloway, were you aware that submitting falsified medical evidence to a court constitutes perjury, punishable by up to 7 years' imprisonment? I object, Cartwright shouted, jumping to his feet. Defense is badgering the witness. Sustained, Judge Henhaw declared quickly. Sergeant Redmine, you will direct your questions through the court. Of course, Your Honor. My apologies, Redmine responded with military courtesy that did nothing to mask the devastating effect of his revelation. With the court's permission, I would like to play the security footage now. After a moment's hesitation, Henhaw nodded curtly, as the footage began playing on the courtroom's evidence screen. It showed precisely what Redmine and the witnesses had described Holloway deliberately crossing the barrier despite warnings, approaching Redmine with clear intent to make physical contact, the guard's appropriate warning, and the standard defensive maneuver that created space without causing injury. Even more damning, the footage continued to show Holloway after the incident, gesturing animatedly to his companions, flexing his supposedly injured wrist without any sign of pain or impairment, and explicitly stating his plan to make that guard pay through his connection to Rupert. The courtroom fell silent as the implications of this statement registered. All eyes turned to Judge Rupert Henhaw, whose face had drained of color. Your Honor, Redmine said into the silence, I find it concerning that Mr. Holloway referred to you by your first name and indicated a pre-existing relationship. Are you personally acquainted with the complainant in this case? This line of questioning is inappropriate, Henhaw snapped, but his authoritative tone had abandoned him, leaving only a defensive edge. My personal acquaintances are irrelevant to these proceedings. With respect, Your Honor. Judicial ethics require disclosure of any relationship that might constitute a conflict of interest, Redmine countered. The Code of Judicial Conduct, Section 3.1, specifically requires recusal in cases involving friends, associates, or those with whom a judge has financial entanglements. From the back of the courtroom, the door opened to admit a court officer who approached the bench and handed Henhaw a note. The judge read it, his expression shifting from concern to barely concealed alarm. Redmine pressed his advantage. Your Honor, I've also submitted to the court administrator bank records showing a transfer of £50,000 from Holloway Industries to an offshore account registered to Henshaw Consulting 3 days after the Palace incident and 2 days before charges were filed against me. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Judge Henhaw's gavel came down with force. Order! I will have order in my court. Additionally, Redmine continued once the noise subsided. Phone records indicate 17 calls between your personal mobile number and Mr. Holloway's in the week preceding this hearing. He turned to address the now thunderstruck gallery. One might reasonably wonder why a judge and the complainant in a case would need to speak so frequently before a hearing. These outrageous accusations, Henhall began, but Redmine cut him off with precision, are not accusations, Your Honor, but documented facts submitted to the Judicial Conduct Investigations Office early this morning. Their representatives should be arriving momentarily to observe these proceedings. As if on cue, two severe-looking individuals in formal attire entered the courtroom, taking seats in the front row. Their presence seemed to physically deflate Henhaw, whose hands could now be seen trembling slightly as he gripped the edge of the bench. In Regina v. Thompson, 2012. Redmine stated with the confidence of a seasoned barrister, citing precedent. The appeals court established that evidence of judicial impropriety, when presented during active proceedings, requires immediate consideration. He turned back to face the bench. I therefore move for dismissal of all charges on grounds of judicial misconduct and corruption of process. Excelled before the court rules on my motion, Redmine continued. I believe it's in the interest of justice to fully understand the extent of the corruption that has undermined these proceedings. He moved to the evidence table, retrieving a slim folder. Through legally obtained financial records, I have documented a pattern of payments from Holloway Industries to various entities controlled by Judge Henshaw over the past 3 years, totaling approximately £200,000. Judge Henhaw's face had gone from pale to ashen. These allegations are fully substantiated, Redmine interrupted, uncharacteristically firm. The banking records have been authenticated by financial forensics experts and submitted to the Judicial Conduct Investigations Office. He gestured toward the stern-faced observers in the front row. I believe their presence here today indicates the seriousness with which these matters are being taken. From the gallery, a distinguished woman in her 50s stood. Your Honor, I am Margaret Sinclair, Deputy Chief of the Judicial Conduct Investigations Office. In light of the evidence that has been presented to our office this morning, I must inform the court that an official investigation into Judge Henhaw's conduct has been opened. Henhaw's hands gripped the edge of the bench, his knuckles white. This is highly irregular. These proceedings cannot be interrupted. Score by Section 17 of the Judicial Conduct Act, Sinclair stated firmly, specifically permits intervention when evidence of judicial corruption emerges during active court proceedings. I'm afraid I must ask you to recuse yourself immediately pending investigation. The courtroom had fallen completely silent, the spectators witnessing an unprecedented turn of events. Richard Holloway attempted to rise from his seat, seemingly intent on leaving, only to find his path blocked by a court security officer who had moved into position near the exit. Additionally, Redmine continued, turning to face Holloway, I have documented evidence of Mr. Holloway's previous attempts to abuse the legal system for personal vendettas. Court records show that in the past 5 years, Mr. Holloway has filed similar spurious claims against 7 individuals who he felt had disrespected Jim, including a restaurant server, a taxicab driver, and a flight attendant. Cartwright, the prosecution barrister, had begun edging away from his client, physically distancing himself from the unfolding scandal, his expression suggesting a man calculating how to salvage his professional reputation from the wreckage. How did you access these records? Holloway finally sputtered, his composure completely abandoned. That's private information. Court records are public documents, Mr. Holloway, Redmine replied calmly, as are our company financial disclosures, property ownership, registries, and political donation records, all of which painted a rather clear picture of your relationship with Judge Henhaw when properly examined. Redmine turned back to address the deputy chief. Miss Sinclair, I've also prepared evidence suggesting that this is not an isolated incident. There appears to be a pattern of favorable rulings by Judge Henhaw in cases involving associates of Mr. Holloway dating back approximately 4 years. From his seat, now seeming to physically shrink with each new revelation, Judge Henhaw finally erupted. This is outrageous. You're a ceremonial guard, not a legal investigator. Who do you think you are to come into my courtroom and make these accusations? Set. The outburst hung in the air like a confession. Redmayne's response was quietly devastating. I am exactly what I appear to be, Your Honor, a royal guard doing his duty. My duty to the Crown includes protecting the integrity of British institutions, including its justice system, from those who would corrupt it for personal gain. Sinclair nodded to several plainclothes officers who had entered the courtroom. Judge Henhaw, Mr. Holloway, I'm afraid you'll both need to accompany the officers to answer formal questions regarding the evidence that has been presented today. As the officers approached the bench, Henhaw's demeanor transformed from outrage to panic. This is all a misunderstanding, he insisted, his voice rising. The payments were for legitimate consulting services. There was no quid pro quo arrangement, the timing of the payments coinciding precisely with your favorable rulings in cases involving Holloway Associates suggests otherwise, Redmayne noted, as does the recorded conversation between you and Mr. Holloway from last Friday, in which you explicitly discussed ensuring that I would be made an example of regardless of the evidence presented. He recorded us. Holloway gasped, his face contorted with shock. I did nothing of the sort, Redmayne replied. However, it appears that the Metropolitan Police Anti-Corruption Unit has had Mr. Holloway under surveillance for several months as part of a broader investigation into influence peddling. They were kind enough to share relevant information once I brought this case to their attention. See, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, admitting a distinguished figure in judicial robes. All rise called the bailiff automatically, though most in the gallery were already on their feet, watching the unprecedented drama unfold. I am Justice Alina Blackwood of the High Court, the newcomer announced, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone unaccustomed to being questioned. I have been apprised of the situation and will be taking over these proceedings effective immediately. She approached the bench where Henha still sat frozen between defiance and despair. Judge Henha, you are relieved of your duties pending full investigation. Please surrender your judicial credentials to the clerk before leaving with the officers. 2 court security officers now stood on either side of Henha, their presence making clear that compliance was not optional. With trembling hands, Henha removed his credentials and placed them on the bench before standing to allow himself to be escorted from the courtroom. At the complainant table, Holloway was experiencing a similar reversal of fortune, as plainclothes officers secured his wrists with handcuffs. This is a mistake, he protested, his earlier confidence entirely evaporated. I have political connections. This won't stand. Mr. Holloway, Justice Blackwood addressed him directly. You are being detained on suspicion of attempting to pervert the course of justice. Witness intimidation, presenting falsified evidence, and judicial bribery. Each of these offenses carries a substantial prison sentence. I suggest you exercise your right to remain silent until proper legal representation can be arranged. As Holloway was led away, still protesting, Justice Blackwood turned her attention to Sergeant Redmayne, who had maintained his perfect military bearing throughout the dramatic turn of events. Sergeant, on behalf of the justice system, I extend a formal apology for the ordeal you have been subjected to. The charges against you are dismissed with prejudice, and a notation will be made in the official record that they were brought under corrupt circumstances. Quote, Thank you, Your Honor, Redmayne replied with a respectful nod. I must say, Justice Blackwood continued, a hint of admiration creeping into her professional demeanor, your handling of this situation has been remarkable. One might almost suspect you have some background in law. I serve where duty requires. Your Honor, Redmayne answered simply. Gallery, still processing the whirlwind of revelations, broke into spontaneous applause. Justice Blackwood allowed it to continue for a moment before gently rapping her gavel. Order, please. While this outcome is indeed satisfying, we must maintain the dignity of these proceedings. Turning to address the court more broadly, she continued, "What we have witnessed today is both troubling and reassuring. Troubling that corruption could reach into these hallowed halls of justice, but reassuring that it could be exposed through the diligence and integrity of a single individual committed to truth." She made a notation in the case file before her. "Let the record show that all charges against Sergeant Callum Redmine are dismissed. Furthermore, I am ordering an immediate review of all cases presided over by Judge Henhaw involving any associates of Mr. Holloway, to ensure that no other miscarriages of justice have occurred." Seat from the front row, Margaret Sinclair of the Judicial Conduct Investigations Office nodded in agreement. "That process has already begun, Your Honor. Preliminary review suggests at least 17 cases that warrant immediate scrutiny." With a final rap of the gavel, she declared, "These proceedings are concluded. Court is adjourned." Set. What would you do if faced with corruption and false accusations? Sergeant Redmayne's story reminds us that sometimes justice requires more than just following procedures. It demands the courage to stand against those who abuse their authority, even when they seem untouchable. Have you ever witnessed someone abuse their position of power? How did you respond? And what would you have done in Sergeant Redmayne's position when confronted with a corrupt judge? If this story made you think about the importance of integrity in our institutions, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories about Royal Guards and the values they represent. Press the bell icon to never miss our uploads, and make sure to share this video with someone who appreciates stories of justice prevailing against corruption. We'll see you tomorrow at the same time with another brand new video. And don't forget to check out the other videos appearing on your screen right now.